From the studios of Penn State Public Broadcasting, this is To the Best of My Knowledge. Good evening, I'm Graham Spanier. Tonight we'll talk about the fascinating field of forensic science. While crime scene investigation TV shows have piqued student interest in forensics courses, they have also led to false expectations, especially regarding the time it takes to collect and use forensic evidence. Tonight we'll talk about the sometimes tedious, always fascinating world of forensic science. We'll also tell you about Penn State's new forensics program and, as always, take your calls and questions. Our phone number is 1-800-543-8242. For those listening on the web, you can join the conversation by emailing us at response@psu.edu. Our guests tonight are Dr. Robert Schaller, a professor of biochemistry and molecular biology. He was the forensic scientist who led the massive DNA testing effort to identify victims of the World Trade Center attacks. He now heads Penn State's new forensic science program. Also joining us is Dr. George Millner. Dr. Millner is a professor of archaeological anthropology and a faculty member in Penn State's forensic science program. I want to thank you both very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Schaller, let's start with you. These CSI-type programs have certainly generated a lot of student interest and interest in the population generally. I think it's 5 of the top 10 rated television programs in the nation today. How realistic are they?
Well, it's interesting. There are really 2 kinds of forensic programs on television. One is the documentary kind of program where they really go through actual case files and try to show what the investigation process was like. The second are the dramas, the CSIs, and also a program called Cold Case. And these kind of take liberties with forensic science. They, as you said, speed things up and make things happen a little faster than they do in real life. But sometimes they ask the same kinds of questions that we get asked in real life, and sometimes they portray things actually the way they are. But for the most part, they are meant to be dramas. They're meant to solve a problem in 60 minutes, and so they do.
What are some of the misconceptions that develop when people watch shows like this about the way it really happens, other than the time lag that you mentioned?
Well, I'll give you an example. CSI is an edgy program, and it's a good program. But one of the things they're always looking for at crime scenes is evidence, but they do it in a way which we don't do it in real life. They're using flashlights in a dark room. In real life, we want to go in and have things as light as possible so we can actually find the evidence.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Millner, you're an anthropologist. Tell us what anthropology can contribute to the study of forensic science.
Well, traditionally, people have thought about the anthropological contributions as being largely osteological or skeletal. We look at bones, we determine something about the individual, perhaps what happened at or around the time of death. Recently, that's been expanded to include an archaeological component, the actual recovery of remains from certain contexts, like when they're buried, as well as genetics.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's say I'm a crime scene investigator, and I go to a crime scene and find under a rock or behind a bush some bones. What can you tell from a bone?
Well, generally the first thing you do is determine whether it is indeed a bone. And quite a few different things might come to my attention or anyone else's attention. The second thing would be, is it human? And from that point onward, you determine whether it's an old bone or whether it's perhaps a recently deceased individual. You might determine how old the person was, the sex of that individual, and the like.
Mm-hmm. How often are forensic anthropologists called on to help with questions like that?
Not that often. People like Doug Ublacher at the Smithsonian receives quite a few a year because he gets all the FBI cases. Mm-hmm. In my particular case, it would just be primarily local police, state police and the like, who bring materials in. Quite often around here it would be deer bone.
Someone brings in a bone, and
non-human bone,
the first thing you find out is it's really a deer, it's not a human.
Right.
They don't have to worry that something terrible happened.
That's correct.
Now you can tell gender, you can tell whether it's a male or a female, age.
Age of the individual as well.
And what other things might, trauma?
The key things that you're usually asked would be how old that individual is, the sex of the individual, that individual's ancestry, the stature of the individual, any identifying characteristics, for example, did they have certain types of dental work done, and the like. And then, of course, you're also involved in the identification of the circumstances that happen at around death, whether how the person may have been killed, what happened to the body afterwards, perhaps the amount of time that's elapsed between death and discovery.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Schaller, you've said that the Penn State program is going to be the best, most rigorous, advanced forensic science program in the country. I know that's what we wanted when we set it up and twisted your arm to come and head it up. But tell us what you have in mind and a little bit about why the program will emerge that way.
Well, the first thing we're going to do is create really good scientists. My experience in the real world is that people come out of forensic science programs and they're not well grounded in the science. So we're going to create scientists first. And then we're also going to give them a very strong hands-on component. We have a house in the middle of campus. It's an 1880s Victorian house that we're in the process right now of converting it into a crime scene house. And the very first forensic course that our students are going to take are called the Principles of Crime Scene Investigation. And they're going to learn how to process homicide scenes and burglary scenes, and they're going to learn how to do it the proper way. And we're going to be scrutinizing their every move because we're outfitting this with audio and video. So we'll be able to talk to them, and they'll be able to talk to us. And then we'll be able to tape what they do so we can play it back to them and show them what they did right or wrong.
What's the job market like these days?
I think it's a great job market. And one of the things that we're really interested in is, like I said, creating scientists. And people coming through this program don't necessarily have to go out and get a job in a crime laboratory. They could go into forensic medicine, and they'll be heads and shoulders above other people going into medical school because they'll have a real strong forensic background to take them into the medical school, and the other people who want to be forensic physicians won't have that background. They'll have to learn it on the job after they get their medical degree.
Mm-hmm. I want to remind our viewers that this is To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU TV and FM, also on the Pennsylvania Cable Network. I'm Graham Spanier, president of Penn State, and our guests tonight are Dr. Robert Schaller, director of Penn State's new forensic science program. He's also the forensic scientist who led the massive DNA testing effort to identify those killed in the World Trade Center attacks. And Dr. George Millner is a professor of archaeological anthropology and a member of the faculty in our forensic science program. Give us a call at 1-800-543-8242 or email us at response@psu.edu if you'd like to join in on our discussion tonight. We'll be happy to put you on the air. Dr. Schaller, is it possible that all of these crime scene television shows where people are being exposed to some of the nuances of forensic science are making criminals smarter? Is that anything that's a worry out there we should wonder about?
Well, that's a good question. You know, we've had fingerprints around for a very long time, and people aren't cutting off their fingers to go to commit crimes, but they do wear gloves. Unfortunately, the criminals aren't as smart as they think they are. They'll leave their gloves at the crime scene, and then their fingerprints are on the inside of the gloves. Mm-hmm. So they're not as smart as they think they are. But I think if they look at these things, they might get some ideas. But you really have to know what you're doing in order to do it, in order to cover it up really well.
Yeah. Well, now, I don't know if we should be giving away trade secrets here on public television, but give us some examples of some of the things that you've discovered in the course of your career, or even typical things, not necessarily the unusual ones, where you'll discover some piece of evidence that a criminal would have had to have been very smart to avoid, but didn't, that led to a finding of interest.
Well, one thing I remember vividly was in New York, a guy went in to rob McDonald's, and he shot his finger off. And so he left his actual finger at the crime scene. And so they were able to get his finger, do the fingerprint, and of course he had been on file, so they picked him up pretty quickly. You know, when you go to these scenes and you start looking around for evidence, one of the things you're always looking for is something that came from the guy who was there, the perpetrator of the crime. And there's something called the Lowcard exchange principle. It was postulated in 1911 by Edmond Lowcard, who was a French scientist. And what he said was, any people at a crime scene, any people who go anywhere, and there's an exchange between them. There's going to be an exchange of material from the person to the victim, to the scene, and from the scene back to those people. So there's always going to be an exchange of what we call physical evidence or trace evidence. And that can be blood, it could be fibers from a coat, it could be a hair that falls out, or a beard hair, whatever it happens to be. It could be saliva, it could be semen. But it's going to be there. And the question is, can you find it? And then if you find it, can you analyze it? And that's really what the whole issue of forensic science is. That's the basic premise of forensic science.
So we've touched a little bit on some of the evidence that might be out there that people are looking for. Bones, as we were talking about earlier, is one possible thing you come across. What are some of the other areas of science that bear on forensic science? Your colleagues, in addition to anthropology, would come from what other fields?
Well, generally what happens is an anthropologist, like anyone else, works as part of a team. So you're not in charge of an investigation, you're really part of a team. So I might work with individuals who would know something about genetics. It's not unusual, for example, for someone in my position to identify bones as being from a human, but then pass those remains on to an individual who would extract DNA from them to help in the identification process. But then you could also be working as part of a team in regular investigative work, dealing with people who are recovering evidence at the scene and the like, ballistics, etc.
Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242. We're going to put our first caller on the air now. By all means, get in the queue. We're going to get as many people on the air as would like to be on the air tonight. And we're going to start with Keith, who's calling from State College. Good evening, Keith. You're on the air.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Spanier and guests. You know, I wonder what it's like for forensics investigators who do all this painstaking work, cover their tracks really well, comes to trial, and you have two experts debating or testifying how these these pieces of forensic information are interpreted completely differently. So such that the defense takes one take on it and the prosecution takes another take on it. I mean, how do forensic workers sort of deal with the frustration and reconciling sort of this, what happens when things get into the courtroom?
Thanks for that question, Keith. Stay with us if you want. Dr. Schaller?
That's a good question, and this is the adversarial system at work. I think if you're a forensic scientist and you do your work properly, you're going to go in and you're going to testify to the work you did, to your findings, and to your interpretation of what the evidence means. Someone else is going to come in and they're going to give their interpretation. And sometimes people who are working on what I would consider maybe the wrong side of the fence have an interpretation which gets slanted toward the argument that they're to the side they're working for. And that's the kind of thing that I think is usually picked up by juries. You can tell when someone is not being straightforward with it. The problem comes with when both sides fervently believe that they're right, and then somebody has to make a decision, and it's the jury that has to make the decision.
Have you lost any cases where there was another expert witness, you were giving your side and you were absolutely convinced, and it wasn't just a matter of, well, he could be right?
Yeah, there was a situation a number of years ago where we had two experts. In those days, I was a much younger guy and had hair, and my beard wasn't white. And this was a very distinguished-looking black man. He had a nice white beard, and he was well-tailored, a very eloquent man. I knew he was wrong in what he was saying, but he came across so well to the jury that they had to make a decision between the two of us, and the jury couldn't decide. So they discounted what each of us had said, and they went with what the prosecution had been saying about what happened at the scene. This was a rape case, and basically he and I were testifying about the blood typing on semen evidence, and the jury decided that they were going to discount that evidence and go with what the witnesses had been saying.
Well, do you suspect by bolstering the scholarship and the science that these issues will become clearer to juries or could possibly obfuscate them even further? And with that, I'll thank you, and good night.
Thank you, Keith.
I think that with the scholarship in forensic science becoming so intense, And I think that's only going to help the situation, because it's going to eliminate the people coming into court, or minimize the people coming into court who really don't know what they're doing and don't belong there.
Dr. Millner, you were talking about being a part of a team, could include an archaeological anthropologist. What about entomology? I think we've heard a little bit that people can go to a crime scene, they might find a body there, they might find bones, but they also might find insects that are underneath those things. How do you bring in the entomologists?
Well, this is one reason Penn State is promoting the forensic science program, because it really is an integrated team that's involved. I only mentioned the genetics, but for example, if I would go out into the field, one thing we would do would be to look at, as you say, the insect remains, to estimate the time which is perhaps elapsed between death and recovery. This is very important for us as we develop the entire crime scene, to identify, perhaps when we should be looking for the perpetrator of the crime.
Is it very common in your experience, Dr. Schaller, that you bring experts on insects in, or is that an unusual direction to go in?
In New York City, we didn't have that a lot. There's a lot of cement there, so there's not a whole lot of bugs for. But that's true. Insects do come, and one of the instances where I've seen insects is at scenes where cockroaches in apartments, for example, will eat the blood, and then it'll go out the other end, and they'll leave little specks. And if you don't know how to interpret that evidence, you might consider that to be blood spatter as opposed to insect droppings.
Interesting. Our next caller is Joe, who's calling from State College. You're on the air, Joe.
Oh, hi. Good evening.
How you doing?
Not too bad. I'm on my way home for Thanksgiving.
Oh, good.
I had a question about the technology in the field. When you were talking about all the programs on TV, movies like Gattaca came to mind, and just kind of the more science fiction aspect. And I was just wondering how far the technology's progressed since kind of forensic science started, and where it's headed. Will these like science fiction movies ever become a reality?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'd like both of you to comment on that. I mean, you said you can determine the age of a bone, or the sex of the person. How do you do that? Is there a machine you put it in, or do you scrape it off, and are you looking at DNA? How do you
If I could back up for a minute, in terms of the technology of the work, in osteology, you range from everything from just simple visual examination. I open up the bag and say, is this human or not? How old is the individual, perhaps? Then we can, when we look at age estimation, we can do things either the traditional way, or the way we're developing here at Penn State with some colleagues elsewhere in Denmark, to come up with a better statistical approximation of actual age of death. So that's a much more of a technical, technically rich, if you will, statistical approach. And then, of course, you can turn the bones over to a geneticist who might grind them up and to extract some ancient DNA. So typically in the work, at least that I do, you cover the whole gamut from just simple visual examination all the way to some very high-tech statistical or analytical techniques.
And is it new approaches, or are there certain pieces of equipment, let's say, that are on the market now that you didn't have years ago that give you a better answer sooner?
In both of those examples, and you could speak, Dr. Schaller could speak better to the genetic aspect, but there have been many technical breakthroughs there. But as far as the age estimation technique that I'm working on right now, that was only possible with computers, high-end computers that we're dealing with.
Yeah. So let's talk about genetics and the kinds of equipment and scientific advances that have been made there.
Sure.
What can you find out now that you couldn't have found out some years ago?
Well, one of the things that one of George's colleagues, Dr. Mark Shriver, is working on is ancestry testing with DNA. And this gives us the ability to identify the person's ancestral background. We couldn't do that a few years ago. But to turn of the century, about the best thing you could do is get close to doing a blood type. And typically forensic science has marched along with the advances in science, typically to about a step behind, because funding has always been in the medical areas and not in the forensic areas. That's changing now. And what we're finding is that the equipment that we use in forensic science, as you said, is getting smaller and faster, so that the DNA typing that we do in the laboratory now, very soon will probably be able to be done at a crime scene in a handheld device.
What are some of the pieces of equipment that are most commonly used in forensic science?
Well, one of the things we use are what we call alternate light sources. And you can go in, it's the same thing you see on CSI, where they're shining that blue light around and they're wearing the orange goggles. Well, that's something that's been developed within the last 10 years or so. What it does is enhances things that fluoresce, for example. You can see them. You can see semen at the scene. You couldn't see it before. You can see gunshot residue where you couldn't see it before. So it helps to visualize things that are there. And when you visualize things, you can pick it up and analyze it.
Is it as easy to pull off fingerprints as they show on TV? I mean, it always seems so easy. They pull those off and they say, I got it.
Fingerprint identification is really an art. The black powder dusting you see, and then they put a piece of tape over it and they lift it up. Yeah, that's pretty much the way it goes. And they do it, they seem to do it the correct way. But there's a whole series of things you can do to fingerprints to enhance them. Chemical methods, other light sources, fluorescent methods, and they all seem to help in visualizing these things, because another technological advance is called automated fingerprint identification systems, AFIS. Well, 10 years ago you couldn't do that. Now you can just take a fingerprint and search it through a whole database of fingerprints and get a group of candidates to check it manually.
Now our email site is response@psu.edu, and we have an email here from Jack who says, as evidence moves around from lab to lab or from lab to court, it needs to be verified and secured. He worked on such a case for the Navy and would like us to talk about the process of keeping track of evidence and its role in the whole forensic science field.
Hey, George.
Okay. Well, that's obviously a very important aspect of forensic science. And it's one thing that, for example, would differentiate forensics work in osteology from standard archaeological work, where we're very interested in context and documentation, but it's less important to actually follow the item from one individual to the next, keeping a record of everyone who has their hands on the materials.
Wasn't this an issue in the O.J. Simpson trial?
Yes.
Yes.
Could you give us an expert's view of what happened there with the collection, monitoring, and preservation of evidence? I don't think either of you were directly involved, were you?
No.
No.
So feel free to give an opinion.
Well, one of the issues at the O.J. trial had to do with the O.J.'s blood and actually carrying the blood to the scene. And the allegation was that blood taken from someone's arm was actually planted at the scene. And they did some sophisticated testing to try to show that there was preservative in the blood. It was taken, I believe it was taken from a fence post or something like that. But the whole business of contaminating crime scenes with evidence is really very critical, and it came to light in the O.J. case.
And as a professional watching that trial, which I think many of us found to be circus-like, you must have had some qualms about how it was all handled.
Yeah, I did. I firmly believed that O.J. was guilty of the crime, and I thought the evidence proved that. But you know, one of the things that happened in that case had to do with the way the evidence was presented to the jury, and the prosecution went through a very laborious, very complicated explanation of DNA and what it meant, and I think it was too much.
Kay is on the line with us now. Hi, Kay. You're on the air with us.
Hi, Dr. Spanier. I'm happy to speak with you and your distinguished guest this evening.
Great.
I am a sexual assault nurse examiner here in the State College area, and I also have my baccalaureate degree from Penn State University. I was wondering what courses or certificate programs might be coming up or available to nurses at the baccalaureate degree level in forensics and nursing.
Was your bachelor's degree in nursing?
Yes.
And now you're considering the possibility maybe of a certificate or advanced degree, or just taking some courses to kind of broaden your knowledge base?
Absolutely, yes. As I said,
Okay.
I work as a sexual assault nurse examiner, and I want to broaden that area in forensic nursing. I'm also state president of the International Association of Forensic Nurses in Pennsylvania, and I know that nurses who are in forensics are continuing to look for more programs and courses to broaden their expertise in forensic nursing.
Great. Well, this will give both of our guests an opportunity to plug the new program a little bit and talk about where we're headed with it.
I've actually had some conversations with some of the instructors in the forensic nursing program here, and we're trying to figure out what sort of courses we could offer from the forensic science program that would benefit them. One of them would be crime scene investigation, because these are people who should have an understanding of how crime scenes are investigated and how they relate specifically to their trade.
What about, we're starting with the undergraduate degree program,
Yes.
but we see that evolving into a master's degree
Yes.
along the way. And what about continuing education or certificate programs or tailor-made programs for groups who might want them?
Yeah, well, we're exploring all of these avenues. We're talking about outreach and with respect to putting on programs for people who are already professionals. As you mentioned, we have a master's degree program that we're asking the university to approve, which would be a 5-year program, a 3-2 program, so that a person comes in as a freshman and in 5 years they get 2 degrees. So these are the sort of things that we're talking about. We're also talking with the crime law justice people on campus about putting a forensic component to what they do now to bolster the people who end up in law enforcement. A number of the crime law justice undergraduates end up in law enforcement. So for them to have some sort of a forensic background is important too, because we all have to talk together when we get out into the field.
Well, this is a very interesting question, because we're just exploring at Penn State the various avenues we might want to pursue. One of the most exciting aspects of the forensic science program, from my perspective as a faculty member, is the fact that we're drawing upon people throughout the campus and all working together in a way that we've never done in the past. So I think that the future is very bright. Exactly how we'll go, well, it's going to be hard to tell. But nonetheless, I believe that this program and its ancillary aspects like continuing education will develop over the years.
For people working out there in various spheres of endeavor, we were talking earlier before the show about the interest of the state police. Here you have maybe some nurses who might be interested. What are the most common topics that professionals who are out there already working want to come back and get more information about or get updated on?
Well, interestingly, when we met with the state police, they were interested in management programs or certificate programs in management related to their profession. So they are very interested in that sort of thing as well. They also have a great deal of interest in just learning more about what they do and getting better at what they do, using new technology that's coming along. One of the good things about a university is that we foster research programs, and so we're kind of on the cutting edge when it comes to new technology. And these police organizations want this technology.
I understand you're planning a course on the topic of mass fatality. Tell us what's involved with that.
Well, we're just talking about it more than we don't have it on the books yet. But we're talking about initially we're workshops in mass fatality management, and the same thing for some sort of a course in the graduate program, perhaps, to talk to in order to get students to the point where they understand what happens during mass fatality incidents and how you manage this and what you can expect and what to do. It's a topic which is not really well thought out around the country yet, and the funding sources and the Department of Homeland Security really haven't addressed the issue at the undergraduate level yet either.
Anthropologists have traditionally been part of mass fatality investigations, plane wrecks and the like. And Dr. Schaller is absolutely right. There hasn't been a lot of training in the past, and this is one area that our program can really help the field develop.
And I understand that forensic anthropology has been invaluable in dealing with crimes of the past, including genocide in Rwanda and Somalia and other kinds of massacres. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's a growing area of interest over the past 20 years, really, starting in the early 1980s. And This is an area where archaeology and more traditional osteology and criminal investigation have come together in a very fruitful way. It's one I would regard as one of the strongest places where archaeology has made a real contribution to the field. It's essential to collect evidence for the tribunals, the UN tribunals, or the other legal proceedings that might be taking place. The second thing, of course, is the identification of the dead and what happened to these individuals.
And Saddam Hussein is on trial in part for the acts of genocide where populations have been discovered with this kind of forensic evidence left behind.
That's correct. And one of the things that may not occur to people immediately is that you're very much interested in what was the cause of death. For example, were the individuals shot as part of a combat situation, or were their hands tied behind them and they're shot or beheaded? And this is obviously a very important part of the entire the criminal proceedings.
Our telephone number is 800-543-8242. This is To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU TV and FM. I'm Graham Spanier, the president of Penn State, and our guests tonight are Dr. Robert Schaller, director of Penn State's new forensic science program. He's also the forensic scientist who led the massive DNA testing effort to identify those killed in the World Trade Center attacks. We'll need to save a few minutes to talk about that. George Millner is a professor of archaeological anthropology and a faculty member in the forensic science program. Feel free to give us a call, and you can email us at response@psu.edu. I have a great email here. He says, "My name is Ben, and I'm a high school senior. Last year I took a law class in which we visited the Central Court in Bellefonte to see preliminary hearings, and in several of the hearings, forensic evidence was presented. Is the popularity of TV forensic shows making juries more likely to demand forensic evidence in routine cases where eyewitness testimony was once considered sufficient?" I think that's a great question.
It is a great question. The answer is absolutely. I've had complaints. It's called the CSI Effect. It is. And attorneys are continually complaining about the demands that juries put on them for certain kinds of evidence. They see it on television, and they want to see it in the courtroom. DNA is a prime candidate for this. If the DNA is not being presented, they want to know why. And it's important that the attorneys have a good reason for not presenting the evidence. And sometimes juries just get angry when they don't get it, even though there's no DNA evidence to be given.
Also by email, another writer is asking, why do you need to know ancestral background? How does that figure in on criminal cases? You brought that up earlier, Dr. Millner.
Right. It's one of the questions the police will ask first of me or anyone else. We need to know that because that is part of the entire process of identifying who may have been the perpetrator, who may be the victim. I usually deal with the victim end of things so that, for example, you would want to know some of the characteristics about the individual so you could perhaps identify the person who's represented by the skeletal remains.
You have the same issue with, say, bloodstains left at a crime scene where you have someone who you have no idea who did it, so you do the DNA typing on the bloodstain, you get the ancestral background, maybe you find out you're looking for an American Indian as opposed to someone gave a description, say, perhaps of a Hispanic person, so you find out you're really looking for an American Indian.
Let's take another call now. Our next call is from Bradford, and we have Ann on the line. Good evening, Ann.
Good evening. Thank you for taking my call. I have a daughter who's a freshman at Penn State University Park campus, and she is a forensic chemistry major. And what I'm wondering is if she stays in this major, and when she graduates, what's the job market like? A lot of competition, those kinds of things.
Spoken like a true parent.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's right. A question of great concern.
Yeah.
We're very specifically training these students to move into the job market into a number of different areas. There certainly will be competition for jobs in the forensic world. Right now, if your daughter is really interested in forensic biology, it seems like that's probably one of the better places to go. There's the DNA laboratories are expanding all across the country. My old laboratory in New York will be hiring 300 or so within the next couple of years. But beyond that, there's still great opportunities for students coming out of the program. They're going to be trained well enough in chemistry and biology that they'll be able to go to graduate school if they so choose. The professional schools, as I mentioned earlier, medicine would be open to them, law would be open to them. So they're going to have a lot of doors that are going to open up for them and many opportunities, including forensic science.
Great. Let's take a call now from State College. Eileen is with us. Hi, Eileen. Are you there, Eileen?
Yes.
Yes, you're on the air with us now. Do you have a question for one of our guests?
I would just like to remind Dr. Spanier that in past history we had a scientist here, a woman, Dr. Mary Willard, that many people would remember, and she served as a forensic scientist. She was called all over for her expertise. So she was really a historical person in forensic science at Penn State.
That's good of you to point out that tradition. I think we named a building after her, did we not?
Or I think after her father.
After her father. So
yeah.
It was a Penn State family.
Yes, but
okay.
she was quite a character and well known in the community. So we're, as a woman scientist, I'm very proud of her. So I just wanted to tell you about it.
Well, great. Thank you for sharing that with us.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah, good
she
luck
was
to
here
your
when I was a grad student.
Oh, well, tell us about that.
I never met her, but she had a reputation as a very competent forensic scientist in the area. When I was in grad school at Penn State in 1968, she was here.
Wonderful. Let's take a call from Merwin now, who's calling from Penfield. How are you doing tonight?
Just fine, Dr. Spanier, and we appreciate the wonderful program.
Well,
I would like to ask the director of the program, and glad you are doing this, does the curriculum include having mock trial experience to give the graduates some realistic experience prior to actually getting into legal environment?
So they, once they do all this great science, they got to be able to make an appearance in a courtroom and make it stand up.
Absolutely true. In the courses, the actual forensic science courses, beginning with Forensic Science 201, students are going to have oral examinations in a courtroom-like setting, so that instead of a final examination where you sit down and go into a room and write for 2 or 3 hours, part of that exam will be an oral examination a la as if they were in a courtroom.
Oh. I bet we have some local attorneys who wouldn't mind coming over and being the judge.
or the defense attorney.
Right. Judith is our next caller. Judith, thanks for calling us on our program tonight.
Thank you.
And what question would you like to ask?
My question would be directed to any one of the gentlemen that are on there. And I would like to ask about an identification marker of DNA at birth, as you would take footprints when a child is born. And that marker would follow you throughout your entire lifetime.
Are you a proponent of everyone having DNA taken so that people can be kept track of along the way?
I certainly am. Yes, because when you think of the crimes or whatever, the people that are being investigated in prisons and they're trying to match DNA, I think that the National Institute of Health might be able to institute this policy where a DNA is established at the time of birth, and it would be the identification marker throughout your lifetime.
At most locations now, when you come back into the United States from being overseas, they're taking everybody's fingerprint and keeping it on file. Is DNA far behind?
I'm not sure. That's my question.
Yeah, well, let's ask our guest.
There's talk about it. I've been sitting on American Bar Association Biological Task Force panel for the last couple of years, and surprisingly, that was one of the things that was proposed, that everybody do this.
you know, and I'm
No, you're
I'm
not.
not schooled in this area or whatever, but I think it's just such a simple solution
Well,
and a simple marker to follow you.
the interesting thing is that the ACLU people don't seem to be too upset about it. And the reason for it is there's no discrimination because everybody's got to do it. And so that's the interesting part about it. It is something which is being discussed.
Dr. Millner, how do people think of it who are in disciplines like yours?
Well, I think that it may well be the wave of the future. The problem is, of course, the overall cost and whether it can actually be put into effect.
Mm-hmm. What about privacy concerns?
Privacy concerns are always an issue, and that's something that's going to have to be worked on at Congress and the like. You know, there's obviously a chance for abuse. So there's a balancing act between the greater good and the chance for misuse of this information. It's not going to be an easy issue to resolve.
Skip from Unionville, you are on the air on To the Best of My Knowledge. Thank you for being with us. Hi, Skip.
Good evening. Thanks for a great show.
Thank you.
Dr. Spanier, I was wondering if the experts could comment on the Brandon Mayfield case, the lawyer from Washington whose fingerprints were misidentified by the FBI, and also what are they going to do at Penn State to help ensure that the students that they turn out don't make those kind of mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll hang up and listen.
Okay.
I don't know much about the case other than what we've read in the paper. You can go on the internet and you can look at those two fingerprints if you want to. I've done that. So I really can't comment too much about it except that apparently somebody made a mistake. This, as far as Penn State students going out and not doing the same things, it has to do with training. I believe that if people have the proper background and they're trained properly, that these kinds of errors are going to be minimized. And people are human, and nobody in the world, when you go out and get a job, says that you aren't human, and humans make mistakes. And I think that's to be expected, and it has to be tolerated, but you have to learn how to minimize these through education.
Well, training is really critical here because without the science, you don't really understand what are the limits of what you can do and what you can actually say about a particular case.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Millner, the science of dentition, I think it's called teeth, is another anthropological aspect of all of this. It's very common to hear about people's remains being identified through their dentist records and their teeth. Is that a pretty good source of information? How common, how accurate?
It's very common for the specific identification of the individual. Typically what osteology does is does the identification in a two-step process. First, they sort of weed out all the possibilities in terms of the age and sex and ancestry, height, and what have you, and come up with a set of individuals who might be represented by those remains. Then you seek out radiographs, dental records, and the like, and you try to get a good match. If you can find good, that is to say, up-to-date dental records, you can often make a positive identification. This is often important for us because in skeletal remains, it's not unusual to find the DNA degraded to the point that it's not very useful in terms of individual identification. So it's not, we often have to go back to these more traditional means of identifying the dead.
I don't know if either of you ever saw an off-Broadway play called The Exonerated. It was a very powerful play about people who were on death row and later exonerated as evidence came to light. I assume we're going to see fewer false convictions in the future as we rely more and more on scientific evidence, although I'm very mindful of what you just said about human error being a part of it. How much better are things getting in terms of fighting crimes through science, identification, the certainty? Could you just each speculate about that a little bit from your perspective?
It's a huge issue. I mean, science marches on, technology gets better, but people are still doing the interpretations of the evidence. And wherever you have people doing things, there's the opportunity to make a mistake. There's also the opportunity of abuse. And we're finding throughout the country that there are forensic scientists who are not being exactly ethical in the way that they're doing their work. And I don't know if this is because they're not trained properly and they're under a lot of pressure to turn out test results, but it's something which permeates the entire profession now, and it has to be corrected.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the scientific background is absolutely essential, which is why it's being stressed here at Penn State. The evidence itself doesn't usually speak to the jury, what have you. They have to make a decision. It has to be presented in a fair and impartial way, and that means that the individual doing the presentation has to know the underlying science, what it is they're doing, why they're doing it, what are its limitations.
Let's get another viewer in on this discussion. It's David on the line. David, you are on the air.
Yes. Dr. Schaller.
Yes, Dr. Schaller is with us, and
yes,
do you have a question for him?
I wanted to compliment him on the lecture he gave about 2 or 3 weeks ago. My son and I drifted in from off campus to see it. It was a fascinating lecture. I raised the question as to whether or not Arthur Conan Doyle had any forensic experience in his writings on Sherlock Holmes. And at that time, Dr. Schaller said he hadn't had any yet. But I think that could be a little bit of a area for experience, and maybe checking. Maybe he's done it since then.
Well, your comments on that? Dr.
Certainly, Sherlock Holmes was the first forensic scientist, I guess, to be popular, the first popularized forensic scientist.
Yeah. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the September 11th forensic experience. I know you've just come out with a book about leading that investigation.
Yes.
Tell us what you had to go through as a part of the follow-up there.
The whole process was, as everybody knows, was completely unexpected, and we were completely unprepared for everything that happened to us. So we had to invent every process in order to make the identifications. And to complicate the issue, we had DNA, which was completely degraded. We had bodies that were macerated because of the way the buildings fell. So you couldn't use your traditional methods to make identifications, which would be dental identification, which we talked about earlier, fingerprints, which we were talking a little bit about as well. So those identifications were very, very few and far between. Also, identifying people just by looking at them wasn't possible because they weren't intact anymore. So the identification effort was really and truly a DNA identification effort. And so the samples themselves were challenging because they were completely degraded. The volume was challenging because there was over almost 20,000 remains. And what happened to me was I was put into the position of managing multiple laboratories who were doing this work because the New York City laboratory couldn't do it all.
And we should point out that you were with the New York City Chief Medical Examiner's Office, responsible for all of the forensic biology involved here.
That's correct.
Before we twisted your arm to retire and come and head up this program at Penn State.
Things kind of fell together properly, right. I think. One of my colleagues here at Penn State, Dr. Mitch Holland, worked with me in the World Trade Center work. He was a laboratory manager at the Bodie Technology Group. He is now part of this forensic science program. And together we're putting this whole program together. And we both have a great deal of experience in mass disaster analysis. Mitch has experience other than mine from airplane crashes. So we have a lot of experience in identifying people. And we just took the information that we knew about and did the best we could with the World Trade Center work.
And as I've read a little about your book, not finished with it yet, the personal side of this is worth mentioning. I think you're dealing with the families of all of these victims.
It's interesting. Forensic scientists, as a rule, don't get involved with families. You get the evidence into the laboratory, you do your work, you go to court and testify, and maybe you'll see the defendant sitting at a table in front of you, and maybe you'll have a chance to see the victim in a sexual assault case, for example. If it's a homicide case, of course, you might see the body. But you don't really get a chance to meet with the families and talk to them very often. The World Trade Center work was entirely different. It became an issue of working with families, talking to them about their loved ones, meeting with them on a weekly basis, giving them tours through the laboratory, It's a very emotionally difficult time.
Well, what a fascinating discussion we've had tonight, and I know we still have some callers in the queue that we're not going to be able to get to, but this Penn State major, this new program that we're putting into place, sounds like it has great promise. How many faculty colleagues do you have all together across the different disciplines that are involved?
How many do we have?
Oh boy, quite a few. I don't know the number.
The surprising thing is just the number of faculty who are doing it, I don't say part-time, but their own scientific work pertains to forensic science.
Yeah.
Well, I wish you both luck, you and all of your many colleagues who are involved in this program. We want to tell our viewers and listeners that tonight's program will be stored in an electronic archive that can be accessed through WPSU.org. This site also links to online resources on tonight's topic. Thanks to our guests, Dr. Robert Schaller, Director of Penn State's Forensic Science Program, and Dr. George Millner, a professor of archaeological anthropology and a member of the Forensic Science Program. I enjoyed talking with you both, and we really do want to thank you for being with us. To the Best of My Knowledge is a production of Penn State Public Broadcasting, and for all of us here at Penn State Public Broadcasting, I'm Graham Spanier. Good night.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.